Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your sources, and we really try to unearth the most important nuggets. Today, we're diving deep into a pretty hefty stack of material. It's all about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBB. Some are calling it the most consequential piece of legislation of a potential second Trump term. And wow, it's had a whirlwind journey through Congress already. Our mission today, well, it isn't just to list what's in it. We want to uncover the real story here. How can one bill be, praised by its supporters for reducing debt, but then independent analysts project it adds trillions? It seems contradictory. We'll explore those forecasts, the conflicts, and the potential ripple effects on everything from your finances to, well, the global climate.
Yeah, what's really striking, I think, is the speed and the intensity, how quickly this moved. The Senate passed its version July 1st, right? After, 27 hours straight debate?
Nonstop.
Exactly. And the House had its version done back on May 22nd. Plus, you have the president demanding it on his desk by July 4th, Independence Day. That urgency, it really sets the stage.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The bill was clearly tweaked right up to the last minute. And those early forecasts, the independent ones, they suggested, well, pretty significant things. Widening deficits, slower long-term growth, and potentially hurting the poorest Americans the most. Now, that's just completely different from the administration's line, isn't it?
Yeah.
They insist OBBB reduces borrowing. How do those two square?
Well, that's where the accounting gets really crucial. See, the administration's claim, it only really works if you basically assume the first Trump tax cuts.
The ones from 2017.
Right, those ones, which were technically temporary, on paper. If you just assume they're permanent now, then the OBBB looks better on borrowing. It sort of hides the baseline cost, if that makes sense.
Because those cuts were already set to expire, so making them permanent is a cost in itself.
Exactly. Without that assumption, the numbers paint a very different picture.
And those numbers, they're pretty big. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the CRFB, they're a major think tank on this stuff. Their preliminary look at just the House version suggested adding, $3 trillion to the public debt?
Yeah.
Over 10 years?
That's right. $3 trillion. And the Senate version, because it has even more relief for state and local taxes.
Small deduction stuff.
Yeah. That version is projected to cost even more.
So it begs the question, how does a bill like this get through the Senate? You usually need 60 votes.
Right.
To break a filibuster.
Well, they used a procedural tool, a shortcut, really, called reconciliation.
Okay.
It lets budget-related bills pass with just a simple majority. The Republicans, they modified the rules slightly and, crucially, changed how they officially score the bill's costs.
To make it fit the reconciliation rules.
Essentially, yes. The CRFB's final assessment, considering all that, was that the measure would likely add somewhere between $3 trillion and $4 trillion to the deficit.
Okay, 3 to 4 trillion. So let's get into it. What's actually in this smorgasbord, as some have called it? Lots of tax cuts, obviously.
Oh, yeah, a lot of them straight from the campaign trail. Things like removing income tax on tips and on overtime pay.
Okay.
Now, technically, these are written to expire when Trump leaves office, but, history tells us tax cuts, they tend to stick around.
Once they're in, they're hard to get rid of.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that Republican accounting method we mentioned, it kind of bakes that assumption in from the start.
Interesting. What else besides those broad tax cuts? I heard something about Trump accounts.
That's right, for newborns. It sets up these accounts, provides a one-off payment to new parents, but only for the next 3 years, as written.
A kind of temporary baby bond idea.
Sort of, yeah. And then on the spending side, you see big VOOS, Department of Defense, obviously, and also for IC, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That lines up with the administration's goal to increase deportations significantly.
Okay, so tax cuts, some targeted payments, increased spending in specific areas. Let's pull back to the big picture again. Economic growth. Modeling this stuff is always tricky, I know. But the tax cuts presumably give a little short-term boost. Maybe that explains the stock market lately.
Yeah, that's the general expectation. A small, temporary lift from the tax cuts might explain some of the market froth. But the longer-term picture, that's where things get really interesting, or worrying, depending on your perspective.
How so?
Well, take the budget lab at Yale. Their model looked at the original House bill and projected it would actually shrink America's GDP by 2% by 2050.
Shrink it by 2%. How?
It mostly comes down to the debt. A bigger government debt load tends to push up interest rates across the board,
Okay.
which makes borrowing more expensive for businesses, for individuals. It squeezes the private sector. Crowding out, they call it.
So the negative impact of the debt eventually outweighs any positive from the tax cuts.
That's what their model suggests, yes, over the long run.
Now, that's a huge projection. 2% lower GDP by 2050. But you hinted some forecasters are more optimistic.
Yes, there are definitely more optimistic views out there.
What's their argument? How do they see it differently? Do they just ignore the debt?
No, they don't ignore it, but they weigh things differently. They tend to believe the tax cuts will be much more powerful on the supply side, meaning they think the cuts will strongly incentivize businesses to invest more and encourage more people to work. They argue that this extra economic activity will generate enough growth to largely offset the drag from the higher debt.
So it's really a fundamental disagreement about how much growth you get from tax cuts versus how much drag you get from debt.
Exactly. It's about those underlying economic assumptions.
But either way, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about growth, the debt itself,
Yeah.
that's going up. And it was already high, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. America's debt to GDP ratio shot up after the 2008 crisis, then again with COVID. It's already near levels we haven't seen since right after World War II. This bill pushes it higher no matter which growth forecast you pick.
How much higher?
The CRFB, again, they estimate the Senate version could push that debt ratio to somewhere between 125% and 130% of GDP by 2034.
Wow. 130%. How does that compare?
Well, it's way above the 117% they projected if the 2017 tax cuts just expired as scheduled. And it's even higher than the 124% they expected under the House version of the OBBB. So it's a significant jump.
Okay, so why does this rising debt matter to, someone listening right now?
Interest payments, simple as that.
The cost of servicing the debt.
Exactly. Higher debt plus potentially higher interest rates means the government has to spend vastly more just paying interest on the money it owes. Last year, those payments were already about 3% of GDP. The OBBB could push that number sharply higher.
And what happens then?
Well, that gets us to the sustainability question. At some point, if those interest payments get too big, the government faces really awful choices. Drastic spending cuts maybe to things people rely on, big tax hikes, or worse options like defaulting on the debt or trying to inflate it away, which hurts everyone with savings.
So this bill essentially brings that day of reckoning closer.
That's the argument, yes. It accelerates the timeline towards facing those very difficult fiscal choices.
Okay, the fiscal numbers are stark. But the OBBB isn't just about dollars and cents, is it? It reaches into environmental policy, social policy. Let's talk environment first. I read that Republicans are explicitly using this to, quote, gut the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden's big climate law.
That's right. The IRA. It's a major target within this bill. You look at analysis from the Rhodium Group, the respected energy researchers. They figured the IRA had the U.S. on track to cut greenhouse gas emissions maybe 40% below 2005 levels by 2035.
Okay, 40% cut.
This OBBB, by effectively repealing key parts of the IRA, Rhodium estimates it would knock more than 10 percentage points off that progress.
10 points. That's a massive change in the trajectory.
It's a significant rollback of projected emissions reductions, yes.
And it could hit people directly, like on their utility bills.
Potentially, yeah. The Senate version, for instance, it adds specific taxes on wind and solar projects if they don't follow new rules about using materials from certain countries, particularly China.
So trying to boost domestic supply chains, maybe?
That's the stated goal, yes. But Rhodium calculates that, in the short term at least, this could raise the cost of building new renewable energy projects by 10 to 20%.
On top of losing the IRA tax credits they relied on.
Exactly. So double whammies for renewables costs.
Okay, moving from environment to sort of the human impact. Social policy. We hear a lot from Mr. Trump about helping the forgotten man, the least well off. But who actually benefits most from this bill, according to the analyses?
Well, if you look at the work by scholars at the University of Pennsylvania, they analyzed the House version, and the results were pretty stark.
How so?
They found that Americans earning the least under about $17,000 a year could actually see their income fall by about $820 a year on average.
A fall in income.
Yeah, about a 5.7% reduction for the median person in that group.
And at the other end, the very wealthy.
The richest 0.1% people earning over $4.3 million a year, they could see a gain of about $390,000 a year.
Wow. $820 loss versus $390,000 gain. That's quite a contrast.
It's a significant redistribution upwards, according to that analysis, a 2.8% income increase for that top group.
And it's not just the tax code driving this. Are there spending cuts affecting lower income folks too?
Yes. Definitely. Both the House and Senate bills make changes, cuts essentially, to programs that primarily benefit poorer Americans, like SNAP, the food stamp program. The Commonwealth Fund analyzed the House bill's impact here, and interestingly, they found it would hit particularly hard in some states where Trump actually won by huge margins, like Mississippi.
So the impacts might not align perfectly with the political support map.
It highlights a potential disconnect, yes.
But maybe the single biggest social policy change is around health insurance.
That's arguably the case, yes. Through a combination of tax changes and cuts to Medicaid.
Which is the main health insurance program for the poor?
Exactly. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, the official scorekeeper, they estimate the House bill could lead to nearly 12 million more Americans being uninsured by 2034.
12 million people losing or not gaining coverage. That's enormous.
It would be a major reversal of the trend towards expanding coverage over the last decade or so.
Okay, one more provision that caught my eye, maybe less discussed. A tax on remittances. Money sent home by workers abroad.
Yes, the remittance tax. It was definitely in there.
Early drafts had it quite high, like 3.5%, but the Senate lowered it.
That's right. Pulled it down to 1% in the Senate version and also narrowed which kinds of transactions it applies to. Still, it's a new tax on those flows.
Why put that in a domestic bill like this?
Well, the stated reasons usually involve raising revenue or perhaps discouraging certain outflows, but the impact. The Center for Global Development, another think tank, they modeled it. Even at 1% for a country like El Salvador, it's equivalent to losing about 0.6% of their entire gross national income.
Not insignificant, especially for poorer countries.
No. And remember, this comes after deep cuts to traditional foreign aid earlier in the year. So it's another squeeze, you could say, on some of the world's poorer nations.
And putting it all together, the debt concerns, the environmental changes, the social impacts, this remittance tax. What happens now? Does this bill just sail through? You mentioned some House Republicans are already balking at the Senate version.
That's the big question now. It definitely faces hurdles. Several House Republicans have indeed voiced concerns about the cost, about specific provisions. It's not a done deal even after clearing the Senate.
So this is really a major test, isn't it?
Absolutely. A test of the Republican majority's fiscal discipline, maybe, but also a test of their internal unity and their loyalty to Mr. Trump himself. It's high stakes.
Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive into this One Big Beautiful Bill Act today, explored its huge scope, these really conflicting forecasts, and the potential ripples across, well, almost everything. The economy, the environment, society. We've seen these projections of massive debt increases, potential reshaping of climate goals, and what looks like a pretty stark redistribution of wealth based on the analyses.
And we've touched on how the process itself, using things like reconciliation, profoundly shapes the outcome. These different analyses we discussed, CRFB, Yale, Penn, Rhodium, they give you different lenses, short-term market buzz versus long-term GDP drag. The rising burden of interest payments, it really shows how complex modeling leads to different answers based on, well, what you assume going in.
So, as this bill potentially moves closer to becoming law, here's something for you, our listeners, to think about. If those projections about higher debt and rising interest payments do come true, what parts of the economy or what groups in society do you think feel that pinch first? And how might that fundamentally change their future, or maybe even your own?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We look forward to our next deep dive with you.